If you follow the geopolitical change, now at this moment, there's no surprise that every single nation today is standing at the crossroads. Politically speaking, we're seeing this lot more political shifts and also this political uncertainty. But meanwhile, as we pay more attention to the political agenda, we also need to understand this economic shift as well. Again, as we mentioned before, the geopolitical change is standing at the crossroads. But how about this political and also this economic projection? Now, given the fact today that, for example, China, and one of the largest economies in the world today, is also facing this economic slowness. And this slowness and also the uncertainty cause more anxieties and also cause more issues, not just for the citizens in China, but also around the world. Now, some experts believe that because we're seeing this economic uncertainty, the world is actually facing much greater challenges today, which is possible that we're running out or even perhaps has run out of more resources. How should we understand that? Are we seeing more countries today are what we called rule breakers? Just because that the rules are no longer working, it's time for us to come up with something much better. And should we be selfish at this moment? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Peter Goodman. Peter Goodman is an American economic journalist for the New York Times. And he writes about the intersections of economics and geopolitics with the emphasis on the consequence for ordinary people. Well, Peter, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, again, initially when I discovered you, as we mentioned in the intro, because this amazing book that you wrote, which is called How the World Ran Out of Everything. Now, let's dive into the book right away. In the book that you mentioned, and I quote, that Chinese industry was manipulating the rules of the global trading system. We are seeing the presence of China today, and also we're seeing this competition from this economic standpoint between China and the US. So help us with better understanding. If China was trying to manipulate the trading system globally, is China still doing the same thing? How does that impact the global infrastructure? Your thoughts?
Well, to be honest, that's a little bit out of context. I mean, lots of countries manipulate the rules of the global trading system. And at the moment that we're speaking, it's the United States, my own country, that's blocking the appointment of new judges to the panel at the World Trade Organization that adjudicates trading disputes. So, I mean, it's the U.S. now that's really decided that the rules-based trading system doesn't work in the current situation. And the Biden administration, of course, is engaging in industrial policy. The European Union is engaged in industrial policy for years, and so has China. And one could argue that some of this is a response to the way in which China's rise as a global manufacturing power has affected communities around the globe. I mean, in the U.S., as I argue in the book, it's kind of misleading and unfair to put all of our problems on this supposed Chinese juggernaut that's, that's organized to deprive us of our livelihoods and steal our jobs. I mean, for literally generations, American companies have looked to Chinese labor as a way to undercut wage standards at home, to get out from under unions. And, there's the continuum from the recruiting of Chinese workers back in the 19th century to build the railroads in the United States, to Walmart's decision to go and move a lot of factory production from places like the U.S. to China, where workers are cheap and unions are banned, and you can get around environmental standards by cutting in a corrupt Communist Party official. But, it has to be said that the real beneficiaries of this trade are the investor class in places like the U.S., as well as American consumers. And it's really a relatively narrow set of people. I mean, it's a couple million jobs lost directly, according to the literature, in the U.S. after China entered the WTO because of a surge of cheap imports. And the failure to help those people get back on their feet is really an American failure more than something that we can stick on China. Now, you ask about Chinese companies manipulating the rules of the global trading system. I mean, no question, we've seen now decades of promises from the Chinese government to crack down on the theft of intellectual property. Not much has come of that. We certainly see lots of subsidies, and under Xi Jinping and the return to focusing on boosting state-owned enterprises, we've seen very aggressive subsidizing of key export industries. And that certainly is a source of a lot of trade friction with the rest of the world.
Peter, at this moment, I want to ask, how should we understand the word tariff at this moment? I mean, again, we've seen this conversation centered on tariffs. I mean, let's trace back to former U.S. President Donald Trump. I mean, when he was in the White House, and he was very active placing tariffs, and specifically on the Chinese commodities. And of course, that create a wider gap for both countries. I mean, even some might argue that it hurt a lot more to the American farmers or even to American investors rather than the Chinese side. So again, your book dive into this global trading system. We're looking at this economic agenda. So at this moment, how should we understand the concept of tariffs when we look at the global trading system? What is the scope of that?
I mean, a tariff is pretty simple. It's a tax, right? It's a tax that's applied on an imported good, usually put in place to protect some domestic industry that manages to get the government to help it. Sometimes this is done for national security reasons. I mean, this is something that's now happening with the Biden administration, putting tariffs on imports of Chinese electric vehicles. There's a feeling that building a domestic supply chain has risen to the level of a national security concern. Trump threw national security around very broadly. I mean, supposedly importing steel from Canada at one point amounted to a threat to American national security. A lot of people argue that just ridiculed the very concept of national security in the context of trade discussion. But certainly tariffs are back in vogue. I mean, Biden's using them, has continued the Trump tariffs. Trump seems to, we don't really know what Donald Trump believes. He's all over the map, but he does seem to believe that tariffs are about bringing jobs back to the United States. And never mind that the now 7-year or so history of his project to try to bring jobs back to the United States has amounted to very little, for the simple reason that, when we talk about the global supply chain, which is the subject of my book, we have to remember that most of the stuff that's filling up shipping containers and ending up on vessels going, and in some industries like autos, where, it takes something like 30,000 parts to make a car, you see the same part cross bodies of water multiple times. I mean, auto factory in Britain will get a part from Europe that goes to a British factory for some bit of coating, and then back to the continent to be added to some other part. And this can happen dozens of times before eventually it ends up in a finished automobile. So there are roughly 8 times as many people in the United States who work at factories that buy steel as part of their production, as there are people who go to factories that make steel. So when you slap tariffs on steel, for instance, which is very politically appealing in this time of, nostalgia for, nostalgia sounds like I'm making light of it. I mean, there was a time when people who were willing to set an alarm clock and get up and go off to work and work hard could count on a middle-class living, and that day's over, and a lot of people do yearn for that. And, when a politician like Donald Trump goes off to a steel plant and gets his photo taken with a bunch of steel workers who are going back to work because there's steel tariffs, that's politically very useful, but it masks the fact that there are 8 times as many people who are now going to their own jobs rendered less competitive by that.
Peter, I want to dive into one of the unique chapters in your book, which is entitled "That Everybody Wants Everything: The Epic Miscalculation of the Global Business." Let me start with a very simple question. What is the miscalculation of the global business? I mean, again, I am not. I'm not a mathematician, but when it comes to when it comes to global business, I think, again, number one, that I was so drawn to the word miscalculation. And of course, that today, in a bigger sense, the global business. So what is the miscalculation? And also, why are we still doing the wrong thing? Or is it still too late to save us from doing the wrong global business? Go ahead, your thoughts.
I mean, the subject of my book is this rickety, ad hoc global supply chain, which, the phrase global supply chain connotes that there are like a bunch of geniuses who sat on a mountain contemplating the best way to make and move goods around the world. And these series of systems really have been improvised. In the States, there's a lot of deregulation that goes into how transportation companies in particular are operating. And so it's so complex that even the insiders don't always know where the risks are. Somewhat akin to what we discovered about the financial system in the wake of the great financial crisis in 2008. There's so much complexity that it's difficult to regulate. Not impossible. Industry would tell you that that's so, but it's difficult. And in this case, you're zeroing in on a chapter that looked at why we got this massive surge of imported goods in the U.S., in other wealthy economies, Europe for sure, parts of East Asia as well, during the pandemic. And the miscalculation I'm referring to is that most people running global businesses in the early wave of the pandemic assumed, as quarantines got put in place and consumers, got afraid to go to shopping malls before actual lockdowns shut businesses, that they knew what they were dealing with. This was a classic downturn, a nasty recession, and therefore they slashed orders for all sorts of things. If you were a retailer, you slashed orders for the products on your shelves in anticipation that there'd be fewer buyers. If you were an auto company, you slashed orders for computer chips from major producers like many in Taiwan, like Taiwan Semiconductor, on the assumption that the downturn would hurt businesses. People would be thrown out of work. Less spending power means less demand for cars, so you don't need as many chips, and so on it went. And yes, this was an epic miscalculation, because what actually happened was, from an American perspective, we weren't going to the office anymore, but we were now turning our bedrooms into offices. And that required office furniture, more computer monitors, a lot of this stuff made in Asia. Our kids weren't going to school. Now we had to cook them 17 meals a day, which required, new appliances. We had to entertain them. We stuck trampolines in our backyards. We bought barbecues to compensate for the fact that we couldn't go to restaurants. So we had this surge of demand for factory-made goods, many of these goods coming from China. And the result of that was a swamping of the system for shipping, for trucking, for rail, for warehouse space, and the whole system really buckled. That was an epic miscalculation.
Peter, let's talk about the pandemic. I mean, again, it seemed that something just happened yesterday, because we're still in the conversation and the people are still very much interested to use the pandemic as a reflection to see the progress that we have made so far. But again, going back to your book, you also touch on the pandemic as well. Let me ask you another simple question. What have we learned from the pandemic when we look at the global trading system? We're looking at, again, the presence of China, the competition between US and China, and of course that we're also seeing this devastation of the population decline, etc. So putting everything together, are we going to fix the problems as a joint effort? Or is it still for us to see much greater division post the pandemic when it comes to competitive global market? What do you say to that?
Well, there aren't a lot of joint efforts going in the world right now, unfortunately. I mean, we're really in a moment where increasingly a dangerous form of nationalism is on the march in much of the world, including in my own country, that goes against multilateral cooperation. And when you're talking about the global supply chain, there's just simply no way to address these vulnerabilities purely at the national level. You can do some stuff. I mean, in the States, we have a lot of work to do on just basic antitrust enforcement. There's a lot of engineered scarcity that goes into our shortages. We've allowed monopoly power to build up to levels that would make the robber barons blush. And we can do some work there. We can do some work in terms of allowing labor unions to mobilize and to welcome that as a way that will make the system more reliable. You know, in terms of globally, I mean, there's a recognition both at the political level and in the corporate executive ranks that there are geopolitical risks that are now so substantial that demands some attention to where we are depending on production for key sources of goods. So, you know, in the U.S., again, Biden is engaged in industrial policy with this idea that it's not a wonderful idea to depend solely on Taiwan, which, of course, has done a superb job developing and building semiconductors for years and years. But let's face it, is an island that's 90 miles off the coast of a giant militarized country that claims it as its own, which is a source of instability. I'm not making any predictions there. I'm not expressing an opinion, but clearly that is a source of risk in the global economy, this question about the Taiwan Straits. We know that whoever wins the presidential election in the U.S. in November, U.S.-China trade animosities are almost certain to continue. I mean, we had the Trump tariffs across the board on Chinese imports. Biden has continued those tariffs. He's put new ones in place. Trump is threatening to put 60% across the board tariffs on Chinese goods. Anybody who dismisses anything that Donald Trump says as hyperbole or campaign rhetoric doesn't remember, you know, what happened the last time. I mean, I remember doing a story before Trump was elected in the summer of 2016, sketching out the implications of Trump doing what he was then threatening to do, which was put across the board tariffs of about 20% on Chinese imports. And it was very difficult to get trade experts who I'd counted on for their insights for years to even engage with the question. They said, well, this is preposterous. You know, this can never happen. It's totally illegal under the World Trade Organization. And of course, that was merely the beginning of what actually did happen. So we have to take seriously the pronouncements coming out of the Trump campaign. And if you are running a large multinational company and you are relying heavily on Chinese factories in particular, there's a good chance you're now scouting out alternative sites. People are not abandoning China. China still offers this unbeatable combination of still very low wage labor, even though wages have come up. The infrastructure is very sophisticated. The ports are the largest in the world. And it's very tough to replace that. And no one thinks that that's going to be replaced. But in the margins, you know, just to give you an example, talk to Walmart, the world's largest retailer. You know, 15 years ago, if you flew into Bentonville, Arkansas, as somebody making a product, hoping to get Walmart to put it on their superstore shelves in the United States, you flew in and visited Walmart in Arkansas and met with one of their buyers' representatives, they would ask you, where do you make your product? And if your answer was something other than China, you had a problem, because the assumption was you couldn't possibly be producing at the lowest possible price. You couldn't be producing at the greatest and most efficient scale. Well, now, if you go to Bentonville and have that same conversation and Walmart says, where are you making your product? And the answer is only China, you have a problem. They want to hear, well, what about the backup plan? What if there's another pandemic? What if there's a shipping crisis? What about the U.S.-China trade hostilities? They want to know that you're set up maybe in Mexico to serve the U.S. market, Central America, Turkey, or Eastern Europe to serve the European market. These are real risks, to say nothing of climate change, which, of course, you know, is bringing regulations most pronounced from the European Union. But we should assume that there will be more regulations elsewhere that will make shipping costlier. So all of this is causing a kind of renegotiation of the workings of global trade.
Peter, I got two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about the future of work. I mean, again, this is so tied into this global business or the global trading in a structure. Now, we continue to see the further development of artificial intelligence. I mean, again, believe it or not, it's everywhere today. And also,
Right.
people are very concerned about the presence of AI that poses a major threat to the labor market. Again, some of the jobs could be possibly eliminated, and some of the new jobs could be invented or could be created despite the presence of AI. So, from your perspective, again, you are the expert and you cover the stories from the left to the right. How should we understand the existence of AI, and how do you think that AI could actually, I want to be careful the word, to encourage or even to motivate this global trading system or even this global partnership? Do we see any positivity? Do we see any good signs?
Sure.
Or we need to embrace this decline of the labor market? Or so in other words, jobs will be taken away and we might as well start to figure something out as a global community. Go ahead, your thoughts.
Look, human beings, we're innovative by nature, and tasks that are grueling, it's natural we're going to come up with machinery to relieve our physical burdens. And we've got incredible computing power, and it's natural that we're going to make use of that computing power to try to solve problems and make us more truly efficient. I mean, the word efficient gets a little too much work in some contexts. I mean, my book exposes how this kind of ruthless dedication to a certain kind of efficiency has been actually very inefficient. But, putting that aside, of course, there are positive, there are benefits to AI. The question is, who's in charge of this technology and what systems we have to look at the systems in which technology is being unleashed to understand how it's going to play out. So, I'll tell you, a few years ago, I went to a mine in Sweden that was looking to trial self-driving trucks. And I talked to some of the workers there, and I asked them how they felt about this. And I, as an American, where I'm accustomed to unions, and I'm not making fun of unions, I think this is a reflection of their weakened power, generally tend to oppose, anything that could be a job killer, with the recognition that we don't do a very good job of helping people out in the United States who lose their jobs. And so unions tend to oppose things like automation. And these Swedish workers said, oh, yeah, we're fine with it, because if this makes our company more efficient, then the company will make more money, and then our pay will go up. And which, by the way, is not some sort of utopian fantasy. This is their lived experience. In Sweden, unions represent 70-80% of the workers in most industries. The unions sit across the table from national employers associations. Every couple of years, they hash out these national contracts with everyone understanding that productivity increases must get passed on to workers in the form of wage increases. Well, in the US, we've seen productivity separate from wages. So if you go back to the late 1970s, we've had tremendous productivity gains, but the vast majority of workers have seen their wages stagnate or even fall. So an American worker looking at this same question would say, well, I don't know if that's going to threaten my job. We don't have national health care in the United States. If I lose my job, how am I going to provide health care for my family? Nobody's going to help me with job training. In Sweden, they have very effective job training schemes. And in the U.S., we have trade adjustment assistance, which has been vastly underfunded for decades. So the American worker who is looking at, say, the rise of electric vehicles, or AI for that matter, can legitimately say, I fear this, because if I'm caught in the crossfire, no one's coming to my assistance. There are other places in the world. It's not just Sweden. Most of Western Europe has national health care. East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, there are forms of national health care. There are forms of social insurance. So in these societies, we're talking about a greater ability to deal with innovation and as a kind of partnership with working people. It really depends upon who's getting the benefits. If you live in a society where the investor class has dominated the gains of globalization, then AI looks like, a new form of that. If you're living in a society where you have some faith that, as the old cliche, a rising tide lifts all boats, if that has been your experience, then there's no reason to think that AI will play out any differently. And certainly it's very promising.
Peter, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to the title of your book. It's How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Let's just say for any readers that aren't familiar with the global trade system, and also we're looking at the future of the global business structure and also this global supply chain, what would you expect the readers to understand and appreciate when they finish reading the last chapter of your book? I mean, again, the world is not going to end tomorrow, and then we're still looking at this partnership, and we still want to see the greater collaboration among the members within the international community. So again, Peter, what would you expect the readers to understand from your book?
I mean, in terms of businesses, I think any business that isn't thinking seriously about the supply chain and the ways that it's changing is doing so at its own peril. I mean, supply chain has never been the sexiest issue. I never imagined I would spend a couple of years writing a book about the supply chain. Let's face it, most people go into business because they're interested in product development, innovation, marketing. I mean, these are the sorts of things that get the attention. Supply chain, that's almost talking about like the people in the mailroom. Well, that's actually never been true. And it's especially not true now. And the risks are extremely complex. I mean, somebody who's got to make supply chain decisions for a company large or small now has to think about not just the U.S.-China relationship, the question in the Taiwan Straits. They have to think about the Houthis who are opening fire on vessels entering the Red Sea en route to the Suez Canal, which is causing shipping prices to go up by roughly 400% in the last 6 months or so, as container vessels now go the long way around Africa on their way from Asia to Europe and onto the East Coast of the United States. They have to think about climate change and drought in Panama, which has forced the Panama Canal to limit the number of vessels moving through that equally crucial waterway. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are strikes as we speak at German ports, the threat of a strike by dock workers on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of the U.S. There's the threat of a rail strike in Canada. I mean, these are big, big variables that have to be reckoned with. And this supply chain is miraculous. I mean, I'm not, a hater. It's miraculous and we should be grateful for it, but it's vulnerable. And the pandemic didn't create these vulnerabilities. It revealed the vulnerabilities that were there all along. My book is not a history book. There's a lot of history in it. I go all the way back to Henry Ford and the beginning of mass assembly, but it's really about the present and about the future if we don't figure this out.
Well, again, Peter, we still don't know what the future holds, but it is still critical and important for us to continue to study what's happening today and able to figure out collectively how to deal with unexpected and unprecedented challenges in this global sense. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Peter Goodman. Again, Peter Goodman, it's American economic journalist for the New York Times, and I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing book, which is called How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Well, Peter, it's always been a pleasure to have you on the show. It's been an amazing conversation. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to talk about those critical matters around the world. So thank you so much for doing this.